So good afternoon to all the people watching us in Mantova or on the web this afternoon. I am Simona Micali, professor of comparative literature at University of Siena and a scholar of postmodern novel and speculative fiction. And our guest this afternoon is Mark Z. Danielewski, one of the most significant voices in the American literature of the last 20 years. Mark's debut novel, House of Leaves, came out exactly in 2000 and has achieved a stunning success, both within literary critics and the general public, despite it is an incredibly complex and elaborated work, and is now regarded as a classic of contemporary experimental literature. So thank you so much for joining us, Mark. We are very excited to have you with us in this 2020 edition of Festivaletteratura, if not in flesh and bones, at least in spirit, words, and image. You're in LA, aren't you?
I am in Los Angeles.
Okay. Did you already have your breakfast?
I had my breakfast. I had my coffee.
Great. Great. So, as it happened in America, your novel has become in Italy a cult book by now, but also for reasons which are connected to its publishing history. The first translation of House of Leaves came out in 2005 for Mondadori Publishing House, but it was sold out very early and never reissued. So the book became an object of desire, which could be bought on eBay for 200 euros if you were lucky. Did you know that? Now there is this new translation, which is, by the way, much more accurate and faithful to the original English version of the novel, translated by Leonardo Taiuti and Sara Reggiani, 66th and 2nd Publishing House. It just misses the detail of the game with the cover, with the inside of the book being a little larger than the outside, which is quite significant. So for those who haven't had yet the pleasure of opening the book, it's better to explain at least a few details. House of Leaves is a novel which contains several storylines on 3 or 4, maybe 4 different story levels. There is the story of the photographer Will Davidson, his family and friends exploring a haunted house in Virginia and making a documentary out of it. There is the story of the old blind man Zampano, who writes an encyclopedic exegesis of Davidson documentary. There is the story of Johnny Truant, a troubled young man who comes in possession of Zampano's material after his mysterious death and tries to make sense of it. And there is maybe a 4th level, those of the supposed editors of the old book, who appear from time to time on the page to clarify some detail or adding editorial comments. Each level is interlaced with each other. These 4 narrative lines overlap and get intermingled on the same page, marked by different fonts and colors, and very often by specific dispositions on the page, thus making the book an incredibly and impossibly complex hypertext with plenty of footnotes, cross-references, a very long index at the end, references to hundreds of real or more often fictional sources, and so on. But now the amazing thing is that what comes out of it is not some postmodern intellectual encyclopedia, but an incredibly intriguing thriller in which each storyline amplifies the suspense instead of dispersing it. So my first question is quite an obvious one. Why something so complicated and not a good old traditional horror story? I mean, did you write this book as a sort of challenge, that of keeping your reader involved despite the complications of the text, or as a complex experiment in testing the ultimate potential of fiction, or something else? Tell us.
You want all the secrets. Oh, gosh. Well, first, let me say it's a pleasure to be here and not be here at the same time. You know? Originally, a year ago, before this globe was enraptured by this awful, challenging pandemic that we were in, I was supposed to come to Italy. I was supposed to meet you in person, to be before an audience whom I could discuss openly all of this. And here I am, you know, extremely distant, many sort of digital meta layers away from everything. And yet at the same time, there's a surprising amount of intimacy as well, because I don't think I've ever given an interview in my office. This is where I work. This is how the ideas come about.
This is where you write your books.
This is where I write my books. In fact, as soon as
Just a small parenthesis. Is it true you write by pencil your books?
Yes, I have notes all over here in pencil. And right now I am actually working on the computer that I will eventually, sadly, replace you with the new text that I'm exploring. And so I think it's a value to see that as much as a book establishes what it is through the layers that it interacts with its traditions and then its critics and eventually its audience. A good book, I think, doesn't start with the parameters of genre. I didn't start to write a horror book, right? It's a much more interior experience. So for me, I think the courage of that book was simply to follow through on all of its particular turns, I suppose, very much like the labyrinth of the house. So here we have this house that's growing on the inside, but who's telling us that story, right? And who is that person? You know, exactly how do they feel? How do we inhabit that old man Zampano? How do we inhabit the young man who's encountering the old man's text, very traditional, formal in some ways? Here is someone who's unschooled, who's coming across a story that is extraordinary in some ways, right? Fantastical, you know, in the spirit of Calvino, Eco, all the way back to Dante. But at the same time, it's also something that we can all relate to. We've all sat at a cafe or a bar or in someone's living room and suddenly heard an extraordinary story. And immediately we run through this crazy sort of psychological math as we attempt to determine, now, is this story something this person experienced? Is this something this story is something that this person has just made up? How are we encountering this? How is this being displayed for us? So when all these levels start to unfold in the story, then you simply can either cauterize it with a genre trope and leave it alone, or you can be daring and open that door and say, okay, who is telling this story? You know, and as you were going through all the various levels, you named them all except for one very significant one who appears as a ghost at the very end. Because we can also ask, as we're listening to Johnny Truen, an apprentice tattoo artist who's struggling with the woes of his heart, wait a minute, where did he learn that word? How does someone who is so erratic and apparently uneducated have this particular vocabulary and suddenly see that he's informed by a much more powerful presence, which is that of his mother, who left these letters to him, educating him in the ways of thinking, in the ways of fearing, you know, in the ways of framing his own history. So all of that is what I was, I guess, you know, brave enough or stupid enough to encounter and re-encounter over the course of 10 years, you know. And as I think of it now, it becomes even more simple as I'm writing this next book, which I'm not really going to discuss, except to say that I've just reached page 510. That's absolutely meaningless in my universe. But at the same time, I know that as much time as I'm pouring into this book, it's only the beginning. The book, the voice, the way that story is told may radically reshape in the next, you know, rewrite. And so for me, it's an absolutely open place. And in that sense, it's exhilarating and at the same time, absolutely terrifying, by like being on the side of a mountain that is extremely steep and glazed over with ice, and I'm wearing ballet slippers. and that is how I'm attempting to sort of ascend this experience, if you will, and render it in a way that it is communicable to someone else. And that was always the experience with with House of Leaves.
So you've touched most of the points, most of the issues I wanted to talk about with you.
Well, that's great. Then we step into the void. We step into new questions. We get away from the anticipated and we surprise ourselves.
Yeah. So let's go back to the question of the unreliability of the various narrators. In an interview appeared on the journal Critique in 2003, you said that, I'm quoting, "There is no sacred text here. The notion of authenticity or originality is constantly refuted. Pretty soon you begin to notice that at every level in the novel some act of interpretation is going on. The question is why? Well, there are many reasons, but the most important one is that everything we encounter involves an act of interpretation on our part. And this doesn't just apply to what we encounter in books, but to what we respond to in life." We could just talk about this quote for the rest of the interview, I think. So, but something more specific, this unreliability of who's telling the story. I mean, the editors say that Johnny wrote, that Zampana wrote, that Nevinson showed, and so on and so on. What do you think of the dozens of attempts that readers have made at finding a true text, a real fictional author, an original meaning of the story? Is there anything like a correct reading of your book?
Of course.
So tell us.
You know, I had this wonderful experience, somewhat harrowing as well. I was at a gallery, and an older gentleman came up to me and he said, "Are you Mark Danielewski?" And I said, "I am." And he said, Did you write House of Leaves?" And I said, "I did." And he goes, "I just want to thank you. I haven't read the book myself, but I wanted to thank you." And I was like, "Oh, why?" And he said, "Well, my daughter attempted to kill herself." And excuse me, it always moves me, this story. But he was at her bed when she woke up, and he said, "Is there anything I can do for you?" And she said, will you get me House of Leaves?" So I've heard variations of this story over the years, people who are in recovery and in difficult places in their life. And I think one of the things that the book does is it enacts for the reader the tribulations of making decisions to find that authentic narrative, to find that authentic self, which does exist, but it can't present itself as whole if the reader isn't a co-author in that experience. And I think that's what this book and all my books do. They are a collaboration from the start into a very dark place, but through which there is finally kind of an assessment of that narrative. And what's so unsettling, I think, for so many people is that the text itself is so unsettled right at the beginning. So an example would be, you know, you can write a book about all the gym equipment that there is, and you can describe how to use that gym equipment, and then that will lead to you being very strong, so long as you use that gym equipment. But reading that book is not going to help you at all. Whereas House of Leaves, I'm really reducing my own book, is the gym equipment. It actually makes the reader do the lifting. So at the end of that reading, you have come through to a place where you as a reader are stronger. And that is not to say that you are just a reader of House of Leaves, but you are a reader of your own narrative, of the narratives around you. And I find it's a particularly relevant book during these times right now, and very surprising, something I could never have anticipated, but something I'm hearing back more and more from readers, because we are in an age where every narrative that we behold is unreliable. You know, in the United States, people are saying COVID doesn't exist. You know, it's all a hoax. So how do we measure these narratives? How do we find a truth by which we can survive? So this ability to read narratives, to understand that something that's just come through a Facebook feed is truly unreliable, that it has no salvation for us, is an important skill to have. And it's not something that you can read about. It's something that you have to strongly read yourself. And that gets to the larger project of all the books that I write, is that it is not just to tell about, but to enact that journey.
Thank you. And by the way, I've had a look on the Italian readers' discussions of your book, for instance, on anobi.com, and discovered that many of the Italian reviewers of House of Leaves declared that they had taken the chance to read it or reread it during the pandemic lockdown. You know, we had quite a long lockdown in Italy, taking 3 months. So do you think the sense of isolation and existential displacement, being stuck within your house, everything we experienced last spring might add something to the reading of the book, might resonate with it in new and unexpected ways that you had not anticipated 20 years ago?
Yes, I mean, it's certainly for the brave-hearted. I suppose there's a wonderful fantasy that my small home could be much, much larger while I'm stuck, you know, with the pandemic. But then there's the
many of us desire to open a door and find a long corridor.
Exactly, and then suddenly there's the dis-ease or disease of understanding that new space may be far more terrifying than we wanted, and so how we face that is very important. Yes, I think how we isolate ourselves, how we connect with others, is certainly germane to the book. I mean, the book in many ways physically renders those distances between relationships. You know, how you can be right next to someone and feel extremely far apart from them. Or we can be far apart from one another and for a moment feel very, very close.
Listen, still about readers, how would you describe the ideal reader of House of Leaves? I'm talking about what Umberto Eco called the model reader, the figure you had in mind while writing your book. I mean, more an intellectual or a passionate of gothic books or both?
Yeah, this was also the idea that Ezra Pound put forth, is that there would be this sort of messianic reader who would come to render all of these pieces whole. I got over that when I was 19. And I am very grateful actually to a young woman who was working at a little grocery store, and I was there late at night struggling with a paper on Thomas Pynchon's Gravity's Rainbow. And I was tracking all the allusions, and I was reading all the criticism, and I was there to get the biggest cup of coffee I could muster. And she saw the book because I was carrying it with me. I was working on it, but I seemed to needed to clutch it apparently and go out at midnight to get my coffee. I couldn't even leave it alone on my desk. And she said, "Oh, that's a pretty cool book." She wasn't at the university. She told me she dropped out of high school, but she just loved the book. She just moved her. And it was at that moment that I went through this important looking glass that great work doesn't need to be distinguished by an elite set of readers. You know, the point is, you know, my ideal reader is always going to be the brave heart. You know, it doesn't matter what you've read. It doesn't matter what you've studied. But are you brave enough to look into this darkness and ultimately look into your own darkness? And that will distinguish you. It will distinguish you as a reader and distinguish you in your life.
I like that very much. Listen, let's move from readers to foreign language readers. And your work relies a lot on language, jokes, allusions, the sound and the rhythm of words and sentences, even the shape of the letters on the page, and so on. So another obvious question is, how do you feel regarding the translated version of your books? Are they still your books, or are they something else which you cannot recognize as completely yours anymore?
Of course.
What I mean also, what's your relationship with your translators? Are they your best allies, or necessary evils, or competitors?
Oh, gosh, no, not competitors, not necessary evils. Again, you know, it's letting go of that almost fascistic hold on the text, like it must be mine. You know, these are artists. They're, as I said, House of Leaves is a collaboration with the reader. It's immediately a collaboration with the translator. You know, I'm happy to step, you know, to the side and offer what assistance I can, what insight. But in reality, you know, the Italian language, or you know, is immensely rich. So it becomes an entirely different project, and how it's rendered, how it sounds, how it moves is entirely left up to the translator. So this is more sort of a musical artistry of here's the piece that I've written, and now you take it and you make it your own. So for me, it's very exciting, and whatever I can piece together with my own, you know, knowledge of the language, nothing compares to actually the echoes and reverberations I begin to hear through, you know, Italian readers and how they're discussing it and you know what it means. I think the only familiarity that my books are granted, unlike any other book, is that I can pick up House of Leaves, whether it's in Russian, Greek, Japanese, Italian, and I know exactly where I am. I can tell, I know exactly that that's the Labyrinth chapter, or I know that's the Rescue chapter, or I know this is Johnny's mother reaching out across the decades to talk to him and teach him.
Okay. Listen, let's go back to something you said before, you hinted to before. There's another passage which has struck me as quite significant in relation to your conception of artistic representation. Zampano is reflecting on the discussions regarding the truthfulness of the Navidson record and writes, currently, the greatest threat comes from the area of digital manipulation, and then goes on quoting an article by Andy Grunberg, a real one, a real source this time, saying, in the future, readers of newspapers and magazines will probably view news pictures more as illustrations than as reportage, since they will be well aware that they can no longer distinguish between a genuine image and one that has been manipulated. Connected to this, Mark Taylor, in his book, has written that House of Leaves is a book about how to read in a world when the real, however it is figured, is always slipping away. So I wanted to ask you if you do agree with Taylor, and if yes, if what you've done in this book was, and with the Navidson records, the discussion on the truthfulness of the image was more like a playful game with fictionality, or a serious, worried reflection on the loss of authenticity in the era of digital media.
So the real question is, was there ever authenticity to begin with? That's what we're really talking about. And that's the part that unsettles us. It makes us seasick, even if we don't have our two legs. So it's, you know, there was a period, you know, of almost youthful exuberance where the image brought to us certainty. It proved everything, right? Suddenly we had the image to say that this happened. And we found a great deal of comfort in that, you know? And there are biological reasons for that. You know, we have to work hard to comprehend text, to manipulate it. You know, it's innate to who we are, and yet it's artificial. We have to teach our children the alphabet. We have to teach them how to pronounce everything, right? But the image is so rapid, and it is so easily accessed and absorbed and remembered. We can remember thousands of images without even realizing it, right? So how beautiful when the age of the image came along with the with silver paper, and now, you know, sort of, you know, it became more easily developed Polaroids, and then finally with such great detail, and finally transmittable with cameras and, you know, television, and now sort of, you know, the digital revolution we're in. But that wasn't to say that it was authentic. It was just to say that we believed it was authentic. We believed that it presented a greater authenticity. And I think House of Leaves understood that, you know, from the beginning. You know, it's you know, we need to also mention Susan Sontag's, you know, brilliant analysis of the image, the question of the authenticity of the image, of the critique of the image. And so I think, yes, in a very serious way, how is it that we see when we really need to see? Because seeing is a metaphor. It quickly sort of resolves into a photograph or a picture or a screen where we are now. But what we understand is that seeing is also is more about understanding that situation. How do we comprehend? How do we parse rapidly and emotionally respond in a valid way to our situation? And that's what House of Leaves does. It starts with the particular narratives of the particular characters of a very limited geometry of a small house, and then it slowly begins to expand, so that by the time we get to this quote, we are starting to see deeper into the future. And it feels prophetic, especially now during these times where we have deep fakes and whatnot, but it's not. It's just a simple carrying through of what we always knew about image. You know, in some ways I liken myself to a particle physicist. You know, I was given these sort of standard particles of the atom, and that is what literature is. That's where it stops. That's the end point. And I just became more and more curious about what the atom was made out of. You know, oh, there's a nucleus. Oh, there's a proton, a neutron. Oh, wait a minute. There are all sorts of tiny, tiny particles within that. They're not even particles, you know, in this quantum strange world. And I recognize that this is a metaphor, but it's a profound reality which undergirds the very floor that we stand on, is that it's a mist of probabilities, of uncertainties that suddenly coagulate, instantiate a moment that is registerable for us, and then can just as easily disband. And to realize that we are in this fantastic mist when we are encountering literature is terrifying, but it's absolutely thrilling, because we realize in some way that it is connected to the very kind of building blocks of the universe, of who we are, you know. Because as we've often been told, we are made of stars, right? We are star material that has been repurposed. But as I was reminded recently in a wonderful book called The End of Everything by Katie Mack, we are also made of the Big Bang. Our molecules are the very start of the universe. So why shouldn't in everything that we do echo even those origins? And I think literature does do that. You know, I think if it opens itself up to the source of who we are, of where we really came from, you know, it can begin to wobble and move and recreate and create anew so many wonders, you know, in this lifetime.
Wonderful, thank you. One more question about your the way you write your books, your approach, your writing. All your works convey the impression of a very strong authorship. You stand out as the author who has the whole text under strict control, with every detail carefully planned, implemented, and then revised.
How disappointed you must be. How disappointed you must be to realize that there's not nearly as much as control. It's probability, it's dice.
So anyway, I mean, this is really elaborated. Nothing to, your work is really, it has a lot of elaboration, not much to share with the romantic myth of the work, you know, just flowing out of your inner self on the page, which is a myth, obviously, but a myth that many writers have been fostering even today. And at the same time, though, House of Leaves promotes an idea of artistic work as deeply personal and entangled with the inner life of the artist, influenced, deriving by Harry's unconscious desires and fears and traumas and so on. How can these two visions coexist? And I guess the hidden question is there a part of your work which you do not master? Something of this novel, of your works, which escaped, subverted your plans?
Oh, well, there's a lot there that's assumed, but I think given what we've already been discussing for the last bit, you already see that the question is somewhat misaligned with who I am, that there is a great deal of work, of discipline, of architecture, but at the same time, it's in the service of immense chaos, immense energies that are not so easily contained. So if we stick with the metaphor of the quantum physicist, you know, there is a great deal of energy, time, money even, that's put into building a very precise accelerator that will hold an immense amount of energy that will slam particles together to reveal new particles in seemingly chaotic patterns. And I think that's how I know a book is worthy of working on or not, is does it have the energy to combat the rigor that's applied to it, if you will. So my subsequent book, Only Revolutions, is about two teenagers on a road trip, and it's told from both ends of the book. It's 360 pages, 360 words per page, 36 lines, rhyming across various sort of patterns up and down the page, first and last page and whatnot. It's an incredibly tightly controlled environment. And yet what matters is that kind of ebullient, free verse, as much as it can be free, you know, desire to get loose of these two sort of, you know, romantically involved travelers. I think to try this question from another angle, one of the things that does happen, say, in a first draft, is that there is this kind of romantic overflowing of ideas, right? And yet the peculiar irony is that when that draft is read back, you realize that so much of that energy was not captured in that draft. And so the more coolly and calibratedly you approach the rewrites, the more of that initial energy is contained. So I think to simplify the answer completely, there's too much ego in the notion of mastery, in the notion of control, And it paints, I think, an awful picture for young writers who feel that they need that stability. What it's really about is this kind of control, discipline that is at the same time matched by all of these feelings, ideas that are confusing and elaborate, that break down, that reassemble, and it's only in this kind of relationship to being in control and completely out of control that extreme alchemy takes place, and that's why it's exciting. That's why we write. You know, we write to free that enormous energy and to behold its chaos. We build those elaborate, you know, finely tuned machines so we can glimpse the chaos.
And I might add, that's why we read.
Yes,
you know,
absolutely.
To get that energy to participate.
Yeah.
Thank you. Listen, I have one question expanding beyond and after House of Leaves, if you don't mind. Throughout your works, I've had the impression to see a growing and evolving critique of anthropocentrism. I mean, and an increasing interest for considering non-human subjectivities, or at least our possible relationship with them. Is that correct? I mean, I was reading in the last 2 days, There's a Place for You, which is your last short story, an amazing one, by the way. And I had this feeling that there was this thing developing throughout your works, from the presence not defined in the house of the House of Leaves and to the small rat.
Yes, well, the you know, House of Leaves certainly opens that door, if you will, with the cat and the dog who cannot be held by the house. They go into the hallway and they're out in the backyard having a good time. It's people that are stuck in the house. It is a particularly human experience. But being a writer is, I mean, I suppose there are some writers who just kind of repeat the same formula or the same, you know, they're happy with their genre cage. But for many, and it's the reason we read, it's a journey. Like our lives, we change, we mature, you know, we understand things. We understand things that we understood when we were younger but couldn't quite communicate to ourselves suddenly begin to become more and more apparent. And one of the things that has concerned me more and more is obviously the climate crisis we're in, and how do we provide a place for that which will never have our voice? You know, it's a system that's rigged on behalf of humanity. You know, no one else can get a vote unless you can speak fluently in this language. And so we deprive our vast ecosystems, our vast partners in this project on Earth, any kind of vote. There is no, we talk endlessly about democracy and never of biocracy, you know. And how do we begin to share this space? And the irony, of course, is the better that we become at creating space for others that are not us, the more likely we are to survive. And the more insistent we are that we deprive the surroundings that we live in of a vote of any kind, the more likely we will destroy ourselves. So how can literature move beyond the human project? And it begins to really sort of grate on me, you know, in very much the same way that rat was grating, you know, on this sort of inhuman structure or sort of, you know, inhumane structure that it was attempting to inhabit. You know, how does literature provide stories for those that will never be able to write the stories? And that is my challenge. That is my chaos. That is what I am looking at now. And it's a very painful experience. It's a confusing experience. It's an invigorating experience. but we need to frame more carefully our humanity. And that goes specifically for language, specifically for verbal locution, I suppose, but also for movies. Like I'm a big fan of Ken Burns. I love his documentaries, and not long ago I watched his series on Vietnam, which was just sort of a beautiful lens of looking at the United States and sort of the cultural conflicts and whatnot. But I found myself being disturbed that as there were these pictures of bombs and there were descriptions of the human life that was lost, there wasn't really any attention paid to the amount of animal life that was suddenly obliterated by these beautiful fields of napalm rising up, and mimicked in the Francis Ford Coppola movies and whatnot. I mean, birds, insects, trees, entire legacies of individual experiences that have been eradicated. Is it easy to share space? No. Is there a problem of predation? Yes. How do we even share space with something like COVID-19? Complicated, right? But if we're not constantly having that conversation, we end up in a place where we're not even sharing with our fellow neighbors. We're not even allowing them across our borders. We're not providing them relief. How do we create a sustainable narrative for everyone, whether they are educated in the best universities or can barely read? How do we create narratives that can create engagement with that which is not us?
That is making me very curious about your next book. I'm looking forward to reading it. Me too. Listen, we have time for one last question. And since we are talking across the Atlantic, I'm curious about a trip in your past I've read of. I've read that in your past there was this long trip to Europe, which was very important in your training as a young man and a young writer. Is that correct?
Yes. There were many trips, but of course, yes.
Would you share with us some memory of your experience of Europe, European experience, and also if you came to Italy? We would be very curious to learn your experience of Italy.
Well, there wasn't a singular trip. There were many trips. My father was European. He was in World War II. He was in a camp. Mm-hmm. He made it to the United States and really never spoke about that particular part of history, but he spoke constantly about the values and beauties of Europe. And Italy was certainly one of his favorites. And so after college, I traveled, with no money, no credit cards. I had a Eurorail pass, and I spent a lot of time traveling all over Europe, and especially in Italy. And it was funny because I had taken a course on the Roman Forum, and so when I arrived in Rome, I realized that I could actually give tours of the Roman Forum. I knew everything, and I would start pointing things out, and people would be like, oh. And it was never done for money, but it was done for a coffee or a sandwich, or some people were doing it. And it was just a great way to sort of experience, Rome with all its, with all its cats. And then I remember going to Naples, and I had so little money that all I could afford for my one meal that day was a big box of tomatoes. And so I went back to the hostel that I was staying at, and I was just miserably eating these cold tomatoes. And the guy who sort of ran the place, he came up to me and he said, Azore Napoli. And I was like, oh, what is that? He says, the greatest football player ever, Maradona. And that was the first time that I'd ever heard of Maradona. And then I traveled up and I wanted to see Monte Cassino because I'd heard all these legends about World War II. And again, I had no food. And there was this amazing party going on next to me. I was sleeping in basically a campsite, but I had nothing. I had only cardboard. I wrapped myself in cardboard. And this family came over and said, would you like a little food and wine. And it was one of the greatest meals I ever shared. This beautiful family just treated me to laughter and fire and bruschettas, and it's just fantastic.
And Italian wine too. They were very fine.
Wine in green bottles without labels. It was just But the last story I'll tell you is that most recently I was on a book tour, and I was with the woman who I would eventually marry, and is the mother of my little girl. And we had gone on a nonstop tour through Germany, Eastern Europe, and we finally come to Genoa. And we had some friends there, and we were staying with them. And we, said hello, left our belongings, no more bags. You're constantly carrying bags. You're moving 2 cities a day or whatever it was. And we wandered into the city, and we were looking at first at our phones. And then the signal failed, so we put our phones away. And we started to get into more and more twisted streets. And then suddenly we found ourselves on a street where there were all these prostitutes. And they were standing in windows, and they were standing in doorways. And not one was probably younger than 60 years old. And there was old pimps who were probably in their 90s. And in my past, I had walked down such streets before, but I was very worried that how my true love was going to take this experience. And so I looked over at her to see how she was doing. And she looked at me and she said, "We're lost." Yes. And she said, "Isn't it beautiful?"
That's wonderful. Okay, so I'm very sorry that our time is up, because I would like to keep talking to you for the rest of the evening and of your Los Angeles stay. So alas, I have to greet you, but thank you so much for this wonderful conversation, Mark. We all look forward to read whatever your amazing imagination will produce, and hopefully in Italian translation too. And thank you for being with us, and have a very nice day in Los Angeles.
Well, shall we say to be continued? And hopefully I can make it back to Italy, and we can actually meet in person and have an audience and field questions. Let's say to be continued.
Whenever you want. We'll be here to welcome you in person.
All right. Bye. Mwah.
Bye. Bye.